Good evening. Thank you all for coming today. My name is John Flores. I'm the Dean of the College of Agriculture, and I'm also Director of K-State Research and Extension. And this is our third lecture, the Global Food Systems Lecture, and we're very happy to have a very important speaker here today. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank also the people that are responsible for putting this lecture together and deciding who the speakers will be. A lot of faculty, a lot of students, a lot of outside stakeholders have taken a lot of time to discuss and debate who our next speaker will be. If you are a member of the committee or have been a member of the committee, would you please stand up? Please help me say thank you to these people. So this is our third lecture. The last two was 2 years ago, 2015 and 2016. It's never easy to start a new lecture and really maintain the quality and keep it going. But we have a lot of support. One of our partners in this endeavor is the Farm Journal Media, and one of their representatives is here today, Greg Henderson. Thank you to Greg and his company for really helping us advertise and really communicate this lecture. We appreciate all the articles that they have put out. As political and social pressure increases to reduce production in terms of carbon and in terms of all kinds of greenhouse gases, as pressure increases to produce more and more food for more and more people, we have a challenge. We, in the food system, in agriculture, we have to deal with that challenge. The world has a challenge. Today, it's probably a little less than 1% of the population in this country that works in the farm. Less than 1% of our people work at the farm to produce the food for all the rest of us. That's a very important statistic. It shows a lot about the efficiency of the system. It shows a lot about how the global food system works, not only in this country, but throughout the world. You will hear more about that today from our speaker. Our speaker, who, by the way, he's an anthropologist. So a different view about the food system. I hope you will listen with open mind. I hope you will understand a different point of view. Maybe we will agree in some respects. Maybe we will disagree in other respects. But the bottom line is we need to understand where each other comes from, and we need to understand some of the challenges we're facing as we move forward into this century and the next century. You probably have heard, some of you at least might have heard, that very recently we received a very generous donation. The College of Agriculture received a fairly large donation of land and a generous endowment from one of our dear friends out in western Kansas. And the donation is for us to really create a sustainability research farm. Very soon, we will be going out there to really celebrate the official opening of that sustainability farm. And this will be the Harold and Olympia Lonsinger Sustainability Research Farm. We're doing a lot of interesting things in terms of sustainability within the College of Agriculture. And we're continue to innovate in a lot of different things. Not only for Kansas, not only for the U.S., but for the world. We have a very large effort in international agricultural programs. We are now the largest investment of the U.S. Agency for International Development of any university in the country. So we have a lot of things that we're doing right. We also have a lot of good people that have a lot of ideas. And we hope that as we move forward, we will be a big part of solving this big issue of producing food for the next generations without necessarily harming the planet. Another issue I wanted to cover is very recently, just a few months ago, I was asked to chair a national committee from the National Academy of Sciences, a committee on Science Breakthroughs 2030. And this is all about a strategy moving forward in terms of food and agriculture. This is a new study. It's going to take about a year to complete, but it will produce, hopefully, some major points that we will really capitalize on to move forward, not only us as K-State and College of Agriculture and our Global Food Systems Initiative, but the rest of the universities, the rest of the country, and maybe will influence part of what's happening around the world. So when you look at who we are, we have a very big voice in what happens in food and agriculture all throughout the country. We can influence things in many, many ways. We understand production agriculture. We understand the transformation of that raw material into value-added product, into food. We understand how that gets transported. We understand the use of inputs into that system. We understand sustainability and what we can do to reduce inputs and maximize outputs. We have a lot of understanding, but we also have a lot of things to learn. We also have a lot of things that we don't know. The bottom line is, K-State, and I said this early in another meeting, we do food and agriculture as good as everybody, and Mark Gardner, which you're going to hear from in just a minute, corrected me that then we need to get better. So that's our goal, to get better. And this lecture is one of our ways to really help us get better, to challenge us, to give us ideas, to move us forward. I hope you will enjoy this presentation today. I hope you'll understand that there's a lot of different points of view out there. But I wanted to come back to what I started with. This lecture series will not be possible without the help of a lot of people. We recognize the committee that really is the brains behind this effort. What I would like to do now is I would like to recognize the people that had the idea to start this. A few years back, a member of the Gardner family came and talked to me about a possibility of starting something like this lecture that we have today. And they were willing to fund it, they were willing to put the money into it, and they were willing to really support it. With that in mind, that idea came from the Gardner family and Mark Gardner himself to really celebrate and honor their father, Henry C. Gardner. So I would like to ask Mark Gardner to come to the podium, who is the president of Gardner Angus Ranch, and he is a K-Stater. So Mark Gardner.
Thank you so much, Dean Flores. Kansas State University, 1862, the Morrill Act, enacted by Abraham Lincoln and signed in 1863, February. Kansas State University was the very first land-grant university that started operation September of 1863. Do we have challenges? Yes. Do we have opportunities? You better believe we do. There was a little thing called the Civil War going on in 1862 and 1863. And so when we talk about this lecture series and we talk about agriculture, we need a dialogue and talk about the challenges and think about, what can I do? What can you do to make this a better place? That's the Kansas State way. And I like to think when we have all these students here and this opportunity, you are being prepared to do things. You're being equipped in ways much better even than I was in my generation, but the opportunity is there. And so when we bring these things to talk about, and we think about agriculture, which agriculture is the world's most important commodity when we raise food. Economically, I mean, we can't live without food. When we had the water lecture last year, we talked about the rule of 7 and the need for water. Well, food's just right behind that. And so when we look at those opportunities, and when I think about being a beef producer, an agriculturalist, a multi-generational rancher, you know, do we all have to agree? Do we all have to get along? No. Do we need to talk about it, and we need to engage each other to where we can develop plans, develop opportunities to make this a better place? The statistics that Dr. Clay is going to present tonight, those aren't someone else's problem. It's up to you, and it's up to me to see, what can I do to make this a better place? You're going to school at the world's premier land-grant university. The K-State way is, we can do this. We will do this. Go K-State.
He's passionate. It's my pleasure now to introduce our president, President Richard Myers, who will introduce our speaker. Let me say a few words about our president. He's a retired U.S. Force general that returned to his home state and his alma mater to serve K-State University as president. He graduated from this university in 1965 with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, and then joined the Air Force through K-State's ROTC program. The native Kansan from Miriam loyally served his country and retired as a 4-star general. From 2001 to 2005, he served as the 15th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was the principal military advisor to the U.S. President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. Throughout General Myers' active duty, he continued his close relationship with K-State. In 2000, he presented the 118th Landon Lecture at K-State, and he also has one building named after him, the General Richard B. Meyer Hall, home of the Army ROTC and Air Force ROTC programs. President Myers is a foundation professor of military history and leadership at K-State. He and his wife, Mary Jo, have served as co-chairs of Kansas State University Innovation and Inspiration Campaign, and we're trying to raise $1.4 billion. I would like to welcome President Myers to the podium.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge that this lecture is occurring on the anniversary of 9/11. And as you just heard, I was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when the United States suffered those series of 4 coordinated terrorist attacks on our nation by the Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda on the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. The attacks killed 3,000 people, injured 6,000, and did $10 billion worth of property damage. So I'd like to ask you each for a moment of silence for those that were lost on 9/11 and for those that have fought in the conflicts since. Thank you. So again, welcome to everybody here in the audience. I want to also give my thanks to the Gardner family and their friends who are gathered here tonight for the support of this lecture series. What a great way to honor Henry Gardner. And how exciting for you and me that we're here at the 4th annual Henry C. Gardner Global Food Systems Lecture. As you heard Dean Flores talk about, Kansas State University is a global leader among universities for our research in animal health, plant sciences, food safety, and food security. Now we're using our expertise to support the world's food systems. It's only fitting that we have a lecture series dedicated to global food systems. I thank Mark and the Gardner family for endowing the lecture series and for the College of Agriculture and Research and Extension for creating this powerful forum. Dr. Jason Clay, Senior Vice President for Markets with Food with the World Wildlife Fund, was chosen to be the fourth speaker in our Henry C. Gardner Global Food Systems Lecture Series, and we're very excited to welcome him to campus. Before joining the World Wildlife Fund, by the way, he served with the fund in one capacity or another for 25 years. He operated a family farm not too far from here in just outside St. Joe, Missouri. And when I say he operated it, probably to understand that he was born and raised on that farm, and as a 15-year-old had to take over the operation of the farm when his father was killed in a farm accident. So he actually did operate that farm. He also taught at Harvard and Yale, worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and spent more than 25 years working with non-governmental organizations. He is the author of 20 books and is National Geographic's first Food and Sustainability Fellow. Dr. Clay's goal is to create global standards for producing and using raw materials, particularly in terms of carbon and water. He has organized groups of retailers, buyers, producers, environmentalists to reduce the impacts of producing a range of foods and to encourage environmentally sound practices in agriculture, aquaculture, and industry. We are so pleased to have Dr. Jason Clay with us tonight to talk about the title that's up there, which is Feeding the World, Sustaining the Planet. Let's give Dr. Clay a rousing K-State welcome. Dr. Jason Clay.
So you may be wondering why there's this kid from Northwest Missouri here talking to you about agriculture. I want to talk a little bit about my background. I also want to talk about why an organization like the World Wildlife Fund, the world's largest environmental group, cares so much about food. But I really want to make sure you understand that what we're talking about, or what I'm going to be talking about, is a global perspective. It's not about Missouri, it's not about Kansas, it's not about the US. It's about agriculture and food on this planet, and what are the key trends, etc. As was said, I grew up on a very small farm in Northwest Missouri. It was 156 acres. There were 8 kids in the family in a 4-room house without indoor plumbing. I slept on a screened-in porch for 15 years in winter and summer. We lived on less than $1 a day. We had a garden, an orchard. We raised animals, and we hunted and fished, etc. We were poor, but everybody was poor, so it didn't seem to make any difference. But when I was 15, my father was killed in an accident, and I had to run the farm at that point because I was the oldest son and the oldest child still at home. And what I came to realize that growing up on a farm was a great experience. Running a farm that a family depended on was a very different experience. And I knew at that point that I needed to figure out a way to start thinking about what was next after farming. My options were 3. I took the SAT, the first kid in the town to have taken the SATs. I had 3 choices. I could play football at Nebraska, I could go to the Air Force Academy, or I could go to Harvard. And the community was evenly divided between whether it was better to go to the Air Force Academy or play football at Nebraska, so of course I went to Harvard. There wasn't another farmer in the class. I don't think there was another farmer in any of the 4 classes. There were lots of landowners, there were lots of people who owned farms, but no real farmers. Now, for me, probably being an outsider in that environment is why I became an anthropologist, because I had to try to figure out why I was so different from everybody I was with every day, and was reminded of it continuously. My freshman year, my writing teacher asked me if English was my native language. I kind of thought it was, but I wasn't going to argue with her. So I just buckled down and started trying to write a little better. So I'm going to give you a lot of information in the talk tonight, and I want all of you to, any questions you have, write them down and send them to Stephen Graham, and I'm not doing this facetiously, send them to Stephen Graham, sgraham@ksu.edu, and I will answer them between now and the weekend. Because I know a lot of people don't like to go up to mics, a lot of people are a little hesitant to do that, so just write it down, send it off, and we'll get your questions answered. So I became an anthropologist, and the first thing I found out was that most of the people that anthropologists think about, other cultures, indigenous societies around the world, etc., are actually farmers. I went to southern Mexico, planted corn with Mayan Indians, planted corn in a way that we hadn't planted corn in the Midwest for 50 years by using handheld planters that went along the side of your leg to actually plant individual hills of corn. And then I ended up in refugee camps, and I became one of the world's experts in predicting how many body bags you would need, because that many people were going to die rather than be going home. And that's not really something that you want to become an expert in. And so a year or two later, the Grateful Dead did a benefit for the group that I worked for to help save the rainforest. And afterwards, I met a guy who wanted to know what he could do to save the rainforest. And I said, "Who are you and what do you do?" He says, "I'm Ben and I make ice cream." So we ended up making Rainforest Crunch ice cream. It was their #5 bestseller. We made Chubby Hubby. We made a lot of publicity. It was their 5th leading sales flavor. And I created a trading company to buy and sell these products for them and 50 other companies that I began to develop markets for, and realized I had a kind of knack for doing business. But what I found at the end of the day was we could prove that the rainforest was worth 6 times more as a rainforest, providing nuts and berries and fruits and oils than it could either beef or soy. But the people producing beef and soy didn't care, because their model was to clear the forest and plant trees. And so that's when I realized that creating markets for these kinds of products wasn't really going to either save the communities that I was working with, provide them with a viable alternative, or actually generate the benefits we needed for the environment. And what I realized also is that, like a person that I was interviewing during a famine in Ethiopia said, you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. We have to wake up to the fact that producing food has had the biggest impact on the planet of any human activity. And there's going to be more people with more income. How are we going to do that sustainably by 2050? That's the biggest challenge in the 21st century. And it's all happening at a speed and a scale that we're not responding to quickly enough. There's 30 to 40 years today between when we see a problem and when we actually see a result begin to hit the ground. We need to be working in a 5 to 10 year time frame, not 30 to 40 years. So how do we begin to do that? And that's the journey that I set out with World Wildlife Fund, was to get them to realize that if they simply worked on biodiversity, bringing back endangered species, setting up protected areas, national parks, etc., if it comes down to a choice of feeding a child or cutting a tree, the tree's going to lose every time. So we have to come up with other ways to produce food that don't make that choice. And organizations that care about biodiversity need to also care about where and how we produce food. So putting it simply, food production is the biggest threat on the planet. It's responsible for 70% of all biodiversity loss over the last 8,000 to 10,000 years. It uses 70% of the fresh water that's used by people is used for producing food. 85% of marine fish stocks are fished at or beyond capacity. It's responsible for 24, 25% of greenhouse gas emissions directly, And that doesn't include refrigeration and transport and all the things in your own home, et cetera. It uses more chemicals than any other human activity, and it's responsible for about half of topsoil loss on the planet in the last 150 years. So the issue of where are we going to produce food and how much more land do we have, and what I would say is how to think about food production in terms of the land is really more about agricultural sprawl. How can we begin to intensify food more sustainably? How can we do that? How can we produce more with less? Today, we use about 40% of the planet's frost-free surface area, land surface area, to produce food. There's about 5% that's desert, about 18% that's mountain, lakes, rivers, and streams, about 2% that's cities and infrastructure and highways, about 12% that's in parks and protected areas, and about 23% that is left. Now, this 23% is where most biodiversity is on the planet today. So taking the 40% that we already use for food production, we couldn't double it if we wanted to. So the question is, how do we produce more with less? And that's what I want to spend tonight talking about. Because if we don't, then this is what's going to happen. The 100 countries that are here, that are highlighted in gold as opposed to brown, have taken land out of protection in the last 25 years. So they've downgraded national parks. That's what we don't want to see as an environmental organization. We think that we can have nature and we can have food, and that's what our goal is. But it's not actually just about the land. This is the change in the biomass of mammals on the planet at this point in time. Look at what the biomass is of cattle, people in the center in orange, and then sheep, pigs, goats, and horses. One little green dot, and this slide's about 8 years old or so. One little green dot is elephants. Now, in fact, that green dot's about half that size now because of poaching. The question is there room on the planet for anything else? And this is where we are today. And this is where we need to be in 40 years. In the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. How are we going to do that? So today we have 7 billion. Let's just round it down, 7 billion instead of 7.4. They consume 1 unit's worth of consumption, 7 billion units of consumption on the planet. By 2050, we're going to have 9 billion, conservatively, maybe more. They're going to consume twice as much because they're going to have 2.9 times as much income. They're going to be consuming more animal protein, more fresh fruits and vegetables, et cetera. They're going to consume 18 billion units of consumption. How do we fit that 18 billion units of consumption on the planet? We need to use 65 to 70% less land, less water, less inputs to produce each calorie, each unit of production, to make it fit within the planet. That's the challenge. Now, population is probably going to peak. Most people think it'll peak between 2050, 2060, 2070, somewhere around then. Somewhere around 9.5 to 10.5, 11 billion. There's no end in sight on consumption. It is just taking off. And we don't know how that is going to be resolved. So we were trying to buy time here by simply leaving some of the planet intact. So why is this happening? Well, this is what I would call the China phenomenon. It took Britain 155 years to double the GDP of 9 million people. It took the US 53 years to double the GDP of 10 million people. It took China 12 years to double the GDP of 1 billion people. It took India 17 years to double the GDP of 822 million people. China did that 12-year period ending in 1993. China's doubling was 12 times the speed of Britain and 100 times the scale. China lifted 400 million people out of poverty. Every government should be doing that. That is what we want to see happen, but it has consequences, and we've got to anticipate those in order to try to address them. And we didn't very well in China. And so when China's economy heated up, the Chinese didn't immediately start buying things. It took 12 years before they trusted their new money. They saved money. They had a 25-35% savings rate during that period. And then they started spending money on food, on animal protein, and then you started seeing price spikes. And you had food riots in 25 countries where people were killed. And this is what, in fact, helped contribute to the Arab Spring and all of the aftermath that's happened later. And yet, food prices in the US go down. I'd say it's in part because we're not paying the true cost of food. We're not paying for the cost of soil erosion. We're not paying for the cost of making our production systems more sustainable over time. We need to figure out how to incorporate that. And while food is cheap, 800 million people on the planet can't afford it. And the irony is that half of farm families don't produce enough to feed themselves and have to get off-farm income or other sources of income. Most of malnutrition, most of stunting around the world is in farming communities themselves. It's not in cities. So how do we produce more with less? We think there are 4 ways we need to focus on. Productivity, looking at things like genetics and soil health. Efficiency, looking at how we use water, how we use pesticides, fertilizers, other inputs. And waste, how much food we waste that could be eaten, and then consumption. None of these are going to get us to 2050 by themselves, but all of them, if we pursue all of them, will get us well beyond 2050. So the issue going forward isn't what to think, it's how to think. For example, on a finite planet, should consumers have a choice about more sustainable products? Or should all the products on the shelf be more sustainable? And if we want to make all the products on the shelf more sustainable, how do we do that? At that point, sustainability isn't a marketing angle. It's not a certification or a positioning thing. It's not a B2C thing. It's a pre-competitive thing. How do all the products on the shelf become sustainable? Companies have to make choices. They have to work with their supply chains. They need to develop partnerships to make them more sustainable. Today we waste 1 out of every 3 calories that's produced on the planet. And it varies a little bit between developed countries and developing countries as to whether it's post-harvest loss or post-consumer loss, but we waste it all over the planet. Instead of expanding into forests and grasslands and wetlands, can we rehabilitate land that has been used, degraded, and abandoned, or put into unproductive pasture? Can we bring back those soils? Can we rehabilitate 250 million hectares by 2030? This is a target that we've set with the World Bank to actually figure out how to do that and to create a fund that would actually help kick that off. It's not a question of if genetics, but which genetics. We had a saying in Northwest Missouri where I grew up, dance with the one that brung you. Genetics got us here, guys. It's going to get us where we need to go. Now, we may have difference of opinions about which genetics are going to be acceptable in some European countries or not, but if you look at where we need to go, productivity is one of the things that we need to focus on, and genetics is a key there. But we've got to be more thoughtful about it than today. So, for example, corn produces 1/20 as many calories per hectare in Iowa, per acre in Iowa, as an acre of bananas in Costa Rica. An acre of bananas in Costa Rica produces a third as many calories as an acre of sugarcane in Brazil. Why are we spending so much money on corn genetics? Is that really going to feed the world? If we double corn production, is that going to feed the world? Why can't, with the new technologies we have, figure out how to put more nutrients into bananas? Can we put proteins into sugarcane? Is there a way we can begin to use this technology to produce the food that would actually nourish people using less land, less water, etc.? Also, if we know that the place where there's going to be more population growth and, in fact, more per capita income increases, if that's going to be Africa, why don't we focus on the crops that are in Africa that have never benefited from any kind of modern plant breeding? So we've done a project now with the Mars company, with the Beijing Genomic Institute, and with NEPAD in Africa to identify the 100 most important food crops in Africa, map the genomes of all of them, put the information all in the public domain, and train 35 plant breeders every year to do marker-assisted breeding, to do CRISPR technologies, to actually get planting materials in farmers' hands that produce more. We can double, triple, quadruple the productivity of these crops that have never been worked on much easier than we can double corn. So why aren't we doing it? On a water-stressed planet, and with water becoming more and more of an issue, today it takes about 1 liter of water on average to produce 1 calorie of food. These are global numbers. By 2050, we're going to need to produce 2 calories with half a liter. That's what a 75% increase in efficiency means. So which crops can we do that with? Where can we do that? We need to start planning and thinking about these issues this way. We also need to think about where the gain's going to actually come from. Are they going to come from moving the best producers and rewarding them through market access, through premiums, through certification programs, et cetera? Or is it actually from moving the bottom? We've come to believe that the bottom 25% of producers produce about 50% of the environmental impacts and only about 10% of the product. If you want to increase food availability, if you want to reduce environmental impacts, you work with the bottom, not the top. You either help them get better or you help them find better jobs. Either way, it's a net gain for them and for the planet. We've got to figure out how to do that. And then there are challenges for animal protein. We live on a planet where there's decreasing per capita, this line, arable land available to produce food, and there's increasing consumption. So we've got to become much more efficient in each of these forms of animal protein that we're consuming. And we're seeing that consumers are beginning to drive markets in different ways. We now have more production from aquaculture globally than we have from beef. If we want to address some climate change issues, aquaculture would be a great way to do it in oceans, not on land, not with fresh water, but in salt water where we have a lot. But I think the kind of poster child for efficiency over the last 50 years or so has really been with poultry. And you can see, looking at this chart, between 1925 and 2005, they've made incredible gains in feed conversion efficiency, in terms of reducing mortality, in terms of the days, the times to market, in terms of live commercial weight at the time of slaughter. But what this chart doesn't tell you is that it's a different world out there now. What about animal welfare? How does that affect these numbers? They all go down. So what about water use? What about using medicines and other kinds of inputs? If you start measuring those things and you start managing them, then you've got to figure out how to optimize all these things rather than maximize just one or two of them. It's going to be hard to do that across all the different commodities, and yet that's the kind of thinking that we need to move forward. And then there's climate change and food production. And it's funny, I would say climate change is one of those things where the impacts have come much faster than people expect. And they're still anecdotal, but they are much, much faster. The projections are pretty interesting, though. So here's a projection of where cotton is currently grown, where it's going to be grown in 2040, in 2070, and in 2100. Think about the implications of that. If this is cotton, where's the Corn Belt? It's north. It's north of cotton. Wherever cotton is, it's north of it. And that raises two important issues. Part of it is the expansion into new areas where people have never produced cotton, and the contraction on the other side. So you have one expanding edge and one waning edge, and both are not terribly efficient, just at a time when we need to be more efficient. Now multiply that by every other commodity where they're going to start shifting where they're being produced. The U.S. does not produce oats anymore at a commercial scale. They're in Canada now. They're in Scandinavia. I grew up near St. Joe. That was the last Quaker oats plant in the U.S. It closed. But maybe cotton isn't your thing. Maybe you like chocolate. This is where the 70% of the world's cocoa is produced. And this is where the land was suitable to produce it in 2000. This is where the land will be suitable to produce it in 2030. In Côte d'Ivoire, which produces 42% of the world's cotton, one of those two countries, last year, a third of production in Côte d'Ivoire was 90% down because of diseases due to stress, from temperature, from water, etc. Another third was down by 10%. And the third that was up by the most was actually cocoa that was planted inside national parks. Those are the kinds of stresses that we're starting to see today. So in the short term, climate-smart agriculture is going to be about farmers trying to simply be as efficient as possible to maintain levels of production. In the medium term, and I'm saying 6 to 10 years here is the medium term, it's going to be about changing crops or changing genetics. And that's another reason why genetics is going to be so important. If we have to replant tree crops every 10 to 15 years, how do you do that with conventional breeding? You don't. You cannot do tree crops in 10 to 15 years where you have a whole new crop with different traits, drought tolerance, disease resistance, etc. So here's a takeaway from this. I'm guilty of it. I think most of us are. We have a kind of notion that business as usual is what we get by doing nothing. It's what we get by doing nothing different than we're doing today, right? That's business as usual. Just whatever you're doing, just keep it up. What we're finding, though, is that the projections of genetic gains, for example, in many crops, are not keeping up with what the actuality is. The actuality is not keeping up with what the projections were. That it's actually not as good as we thought. And in some cases, they're actually going the wrong direction. I think business as usual, with a lot of the variables that we have today, is going to be a stretch goal. It's not going to be a given. We're going to have to work very hard to maintain business as usual. And then there's another context in which all of this is happening. I go around the world. I talk to groups like you all many times. The biggest reality I think that we have to confront is that we have 7.4 billion food experts on the planet. They're all experts. Just ask them, every one of them. Because they all eat food. Maybe not as much as they want every day, or maybe not as many meals as they want, but they know what they like and they know what they want. we're seeing a situation where social media trumps science. Extremes are dominating discussion. They're not defining the parameters of discussion, they're actually drowning out discussion. We're seeing a situation where traceability is not the same as transparency. Where something is produced is not the same as how it was produced and what the impacts of producing it were. And we're also seeing a world in which there's a lot more distrust. Trade, globalizations, experts, etc. So, in this context, where WF is coming from is that we decided to look at the 35 most important places for biodiversity. And we did surveys of them to define what the most significant impacts to those places were from food crops. And we came up with these 15 food crops. And you'll see that many of them are animal proteins or feeds for animal proteins. Now, we don't buy and sell food, and we don't grow food. We don't make policy about food. We're not experts in food production, and we're never going to be experts in food production. But we have a finger on the pulse of what's happening in different parts of the planet, many parts of the planet at the same time, and we see patterns often before other people's do. And so what we've decided is that we have to switch our approach from doing, 10,000 projects isn't going to save the Amazon, to influencing. And by influencing, by having information, by having an analysis, by having a business case that will get somebody's attention who has the potential to move a company, to move a government, to move a policy. That's where we think we need to be playing. And so as we begin to look at those 15 commodities, what we found is that 300 to 500 companies touch 70 to 80% of each of those commodities. That's it, globally. But when we look closer, we found that only 100 companies touch 25% of all 15 commodities. And so those 100 companies became the companies that we needed to begin to talk to about their supply chains, about individually how they could work with suppliers, but also collectively how they could begin to work with suppliers. There are 7.4 billion consumers, 1.5 billion producers and their families, and about 300 to 500 companies in the middle. So that's the pinch point. That's the leverage point. And that was our strategy, and still is. But then we have to figure out what it is we want those companies to do. And that means we have to figure out what is more sustainable. What are standards that are better than others? What we found as we looked around of a lot of the existing work on sustainability was that they were based on practices, not results. And we know that if you give 1,000 farmers the same practice, you'll get 1,000 results. And it's not very predictable as to what you really need. They're based on complying with standards. Do this, don't do that, etc. They're not based on trying to find ways to get innovation, to get way beyond what is necessary to something that would be even more important. They're focused on marketing. They're focused on selling products, not on creating a supply of raw materials from now on. Premiums rather than efficiencies. Producers want premiums. They don't look at costs saved. They look at how much extra they got. And we reward the best rather than moving the rest. So we had to figure out how to define more sustainable for these 15 commodities. And we decided we can't do that. This isn't our expertise, but we can bring together multi-stakeholder groups, those that are willing, starting with producers, also bringing traders and retailers and brands and extension agents and researchers and universities and NGOs, bring them all together, be science-based, build global consensus, figure out what you agree on, what you disagree on, and what you don't know enough about to have an opinion, and start moving. And it's surprising how quickly you get to 6 to 8 key issues. And really focus on metrics rather than practices, because practices inevitably don't work for everybody, or they discriminate against some. Some producers have more money than time, others have a lot more time than money or land, and so you need to accommodate those kinds of things. We also were trying to figure out what are the key impacts across these 15, and what we settled on was that really habitat, biodiversity, and land use is one cluster of impacts. Soil health, soil carbon is another kind of cluster. Water take and effluent is another. Greenhouse gas emissions and chemicals, medicines, and toxicities. And there's the same kind of mirror set of issues for social issues, for economic issues, for farmers and producers, etc. So using this information, we launched roundtables around these different commodities, created standards, and I'll talk a little bit about how we tried to move, using standards, move sustainability from a niche issue to become the norm, and where we've had successes and where not. We launched the Better Cotton Initiative in 2004, and by 2013, we had about 1.6 million producers that met the standards, and they represented about 13% of global production. That's up to about 20% today. But here's the thing that was interesting about that. We didn't give them a target for where they needed to be in terms of input use, but rather had them start measuring it, so they showed continuous improvement over time. And by not having a target, we actually found that we had much bigger impacts on the ground. So with those 1.6 million producers, they used 50% fewer pesticides because they started measuring it. They used 40% less water. They used 30% less synthetic fertilizer, and they made 15 to 20% more money and had higher productivity. That's the kind of thing that wasn't just in India and Pakistan where we started, but also now has proven to be true in Brazil and Australia as well in terms of efficiency. And these are countries where people already think they're efficient, but as soon as they start measuring, as soon as they start managing, they get even more efficient. We started a salmon aquaculture dialogue. 17 of the world's largest salmon producers, representing 70% of global production, all agreed to become certified, to share their data, to create a common database, and to work together to reduce their impacts. The data they shared were, what were the key impacts, what was the cost to reduce them, what was the payback period, what was the return on investment, what didn't work, etc. I don't know of a single other sector where the entire sector has shared data at 70% of the global production. Based on the work that we were doing around beef, Ireland launched its Origin Green program, Board BIA, and Ireland became the first country to set a target of 100% of its food exports being certified sustainable by 2016. They didn't make it. They only got about 80% of their beef into the production, into the verification program, and about 70% of their dairy. But it was a good start, and it's more than any other country has ever done. All those farmers that put their information into that system got to see how they did compared to their neighbors. And that was a very important motivating tool for these farmers. It's kind of like, I don't know how many of you listen to Garrison Keillor, but it's like Lake Wobegon out there. Everybody is above average. Just ask them. They're all above average. And yet, can't quite work that way. And so when you see where you stand versus others, it makes you want to get better. And you can also then see how other people got better. And then there are groups of companies that decided that for them the biggest reputational risk was not about the certification system itself or the unsustainability, but was really a key issue like deforestation. And so 70 companies agreed to take deforestation out of their supply chains, starting with 4 commodities. And then Cargill and ADM and other traders agreed to take deforestation out of their supply chains. And so you begin to see some of these knock-on impacts. But I think one of the things that, for me, is interesting is with climate change, weather variability, with the movement of where crops can be produced, and then having them produced longer, maybe where it's not optimal to be produced, we need to have a system for defining when a commodity is broken. And I think the poster child right now for a broken commodity is cocoa, where if you look at these 8 indicators, yield per hectare, illegal deforestation, the number of pods on a tree that actually mature versus fall off, the percentage of producers above the poverty level, the percentage of trees infected with a virus that basically knocks 90% of production down, the percentage of carbon in the soil, number of farmers under 40. If you look at all of these, and the use of child labor, all of these are headed in the wrong direction. To me, that commodity is broken. It needs to be fixed. And fortunately, there's enough money in cocoa that companies want to invest. So Barry Callebaut, not a household name I know. It's a company behind companies. It buys 22% of the world's cocoa, and it sells it to Mars and Hershey's and Mondelez and others. They have just agreed to replant 1 million hectares of cocoa using better genetics and using grafting. They've also set a target of 0 deforestation from their suppliers and 0 child labor. And they're moving in a system of long-term contracts, 10-year contracts actually, where they will provide a contract to a producer who can then go to a bank and borrow money at lower rates. And the money that they borrow actually pays a salary for the first 3 years while the tree is growing before it starts to produce, so that they actually have the ability to stay on their farms, continue to work their farms, etc. These long-term contracts are actually going to be very important. They're sharing data and the lessons learned with all the other cocoa companies. That's pre-competitive behavior. That's very important for fixing the sector. We first negotiated long-term contracts between 600 producers of beef in Paraguay and the world's largest hamburger company. The hamburger company had 2 requirements for a 10-year contract. 1, 0 deforestation from day 1, and 2, best efforts to double the intensity of production over the next 10 years. On the strength of that contract, those 600 ranchers were able to walk into a bank and get financing at 2 to 3% below market rate. So they made money on the finance. They're making money on the efficiency. But they're not probably going to get a premium in the marketplace. But they're still going to be better off because of it. We started the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, much like these other roundtables. It's now got work going on in 5 different continents and a dozen or so countries. And the key areas of focus for this work, although there's different permutations and it plays out differently in each context because beef production is very different around the world, is a focus on natural resources, a focus on people and communities, focus on animal health and welfare, on food safety and food quality, and on efficiency and innovation. So, why are all of these sectors, all of these companies, all these different producer groups, et cetera, focusing on this? And I think the answer is pretty simple. It's about risk. It's about risk both of long-term availability of supply and about the reputation because of how that product is produced in the country of origin. And this is what's driving some of that risk. In S&P 500 market valuations in 1975, 83% of a company's value was based on tangible assets, buildings, properties, etc. By 2009, 81% was based on intangible, your reputation, your brand, what you stand for as a company. things that you can't really put a number to, people are putting numbers to. Now, there's a few other issues that I'd just like to point out that are trends that I think are going to start touching or affecting the debate on food. One is illegality in food production. I started picking up about 5-6 years ago a lot of references to illegality in production from many different types of food: fisheries, aquaculture, livestock, food crops, non-food crops like paper, cotton, rubber, etc. And as we looked at those sources of illegality, what we found is they fell into 5 different categories. One was around, did the producer actually have legal access to the resource they were using or selling? The second was about labor, about social issues. Were they obeying the law? Was there child labor? Was there slave labor? Was there bonded labor? Were there undocumented workers, etc.? Other laws and regulations. Brazil, you can own the land, but there's a forest code. If you don't comply with that, you're not in compliance with the law. And then fraud and corruption. We looked at 8 companies' supply chains, equal number in North America and Europe. We looked at 9 commodities produced in 8 countries. All the data that we used came out of the public domain, so anybody who cares about this information can find it. It's all out there. We drafted a white paper, have made it available, have just submitted it to Nature for publication. And our goal is to create awareness about illegality to make it a pre-competitive issue. Because what we found when we talked to all the different retailers and brands is nobody wanted to talk to us. Because under US law, anything they say to us is discoverable. And so once it's in the public domain, then it's something that people can talk about. You can figure out how to address the issue. But here's, just looking at one commodity, one country, what we found is that between 4 and 44% of each globally traded commodity was not produced legally. One country, one form of illegality, one commodity. If you take all the exporting countries, all the different forms of illegality, it's probably half, is our estimate, of food that's not produced legally in the country of origin that's actually traded. And that's true not just of developing countries, but also the US. That's true of European countries as well. Here are some of the implications of that work. If a product is produced illegally, can it ever be traded as legal? If a raw material is produced illegally, can a product made from it or with it be legal? And these are things that you can talk about. I mean, reasonable people can actually disagree on this. If a feed ingredient is produced illegally, can animal protein made from it be legal? And then there's the issue of traceability versus transparency. Increasingly, it isn't just about where a product is produced, it's about how it's produced. And what we're seeing is that 19th and 20th century models of commodity trading are not keeping up with what the buyers want to know. So in the 19th and 20th century, in fact, it's interesting historically, commodities as a category of interchangeable products, 1 ton of number 2 yellow corn equal 1 ton of number 2 yellow corn, wherever it's produced in the world, happened about 15 years after interchangeable parts. That's when it was created. Okay, all of those properties were pretty physical: weights, measures, brokens, quality, foreign matter, all of that. In the 21st century, people want to know, is it organic? Is it GMO? Was there deforestation involved? Was there child labor? How much water was used to produce it? Was it a water-scarce area? What's the income of the producers? You can't tell this by looking at a product. This actually requires a lot more embedded information. And yet that's what traders are being asked to do now. And habitat conversion, especially in this area and further north and into Canada, is not just about deforestation. It's about grassland conversion too. In 2014, the US and Canada converted more grassland than Brazil cut down forest. In the last 15 to 20 years, we've converted 50 million acres of grasslands. A lot of this land is not suitable for farming. It's being done because of high commodity prices and because of crop insurance programs. We've got to figure out where we can do farming more sustainably and zone areas for it. And as agriculture moves north into Canada and into parts of the northern Midwest, we have to really be aware of this issue of grassland conversion. So where I come from, we have a saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We're going to have 9 to 10 billion people. They're going to have 2.9 times as much income. They're going to buy more food, more animal protein, depend on more feed production. We have got to figure out how to get that equation right if we want to pass on a planet that has biodiversity, that has critical natural habitat, and that has vital ecosystem services to our children. Nobody can do everything here, but everybody can do something. Start with waste, figure out how to reduce it, and go from there. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a few points to make before we get into questions. We have 2 mics, one on this side, one on this side. Please line up. I want the people to know that if you want to ask a question, you will be asked to sign a release form because this has been taped, the event has been taped, is recorded, and it will be available to the public. If you are watching online and you want to ask a question, you heard that you can send a question to Stephen Graham, and that's sgraham@ksu.edu. If you send that question quickly, Stephen will ask that question if we have time. If not, you will eventually get an answer by sometime this weekend or early next week. So let's start with a question on this side, and we'll alternate.
Sounds good.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Clay. But my first question is, there's no question that food and animal production is more efficient and more sustainable when in confinement. Producers have more control over their inputs and outputs, but the social pressures from an uninformed consumer continue to send signals about grass-fed, range-fed, and other ideas. Will the World Wildlife Fund be an advocate for food animal producers and use their large voice to educate and inform the consumer with a strong message that eliminating confined operations is not a sustainable solution?
So we're actually interested in what are the most efficient ways to produce food. And that means looking at what the science is on this. And my sense is that to date, the data suggests that grass-fed beef has high greenhouse gas emissions, and that long-term confined animal feeding has other types of greenhouse gas emissions, and that somewhere in between is probably the best option. But the data is getting better all the time. And the one thing that I think is going to be interesting is that there is data now that suggests that there is more carbon sequestered in grasslands in the Midwest and in the steppes of Russia than there is in many tropical forests. And so converting that to cropland is something that we wouldn't want to see, and actually having cattle on that may be the best way to actually maintain those carbon stocks. So it's a complicated issue, and I think we just need to be using the science to really look at how we think about that. And reasonable people are going to disagree about this one.
Thank you, Mr. Clay. My question is, I've been listening to you all night, trying to pay attention. I'm a U.S. cattle producer from Kansas State University, yay. My question to you is, can we count on you for a country or of origin labeling after listening to your speech? And then my second part of my question would be, why have you not told all the U.S. producers about third-party verification and animal ID that's going to be required going through World Sustainable Beef?
So the first question again was what? Sorry?
Can we count on you for country of origin labeling? I'm a U.S. cattle producer, and I've been listening to you talk about Paraguay and other countries. How about the United States? Can we count on you to support cool in the United States?
We think country of origin labeling is very important. Consumers have a right to know where their products come from.
I'm asking you if I can count on your support.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Because that is something that we think is important, and it's also why we think that consumers have a right to know if products are GMO or not. Doesn't mean that we're either pro or against GMO, but consumers have a right to know.
Well, my second part of the question is about the verification, the third-party verification. People from outside of the United States coming in to verify my production of beef, and also the results of this third-party verification from somebody that may not know a dang thing about a cow.
So third-party verification, to my knowledge, is very rarely, if ever, undertaken by people from outside the country because it's just too expensive to move verifiers around when there are a lot of local verifiers to do that kind of work. So I don't think that would actually be the case.
Why is it that Canada, through Canada, Canadian already has a rough draft of World Sustainable Beef where they are requiring third-party verification? Can you tell me that?
So third-party verification simply is a way to verify that a producer has done what they either claim to have done or what they're being asked to do by the person who wants to buy their beef. And that's a norm all over the world. That type of verification doesn't mean it's being verified by somebody from that country or another country. It just means that the claim has to be verified.
It's going to be verified by somebody who may not know anything about agriculture, ladies and gentlemen. Please pay attention.
Maybe, but I doubt it. I can't imagine anybody working for a professional group that would do that.
There's a lot of misinformation, particularly in social media, about the goals and intent of the World Wildlife Fund as it relates to Kansas's grassroots agriculture. You've been quoted, "By companies asking for this, we can leverage production so much faster than by waiting for consumers to do it." How can farmers and ranchers be confident the WWF partnerships with the corporate world will not result in an agenda that forces mandated expenses largely expected to be absorbed by producers?
So I think that the goal here is to figure out how to make all production, or at least those producers who want to be engaged in these kind of programs, more sustainable. Any standards that are created have the input of those producers in them, so they're not written by companies at all. They're never actually part, or rarely part of those groups. They're part of them at a political level, but they're not the technical people, the scientists that are designing those systems. And I think it's important to kind of get that out on the table. If producers want to be involved and want to be part of this, then they should take responsibility for being in those roundtables and helping figure out what the standards ought to be. And this is where you need to figure out what you agree on, what you disagree on, and what you don't know enough about. So I think that is what's driving this. In terms of our partnerships with companies, if producers are going to go to the trouble to make changes and to produce a better quality product or produce it in a more sustainable way, we want to make sure that there's actually a market for it. And we want to make sure that there's always more demand than there is supply, because that's the only way a producer has any chance of getting a premium, even in the short term. So by creating more demand than supply, I mean, this is what I learned in rainforest marketing and stuff. You always want to have 2 to 3 times more demand than there is supply, just so that those producers that want to do this, want to take part, the willing, can actually get access to those markets.
How do these issues specifically translate to modern food production for grassroots producers? So for example, several years ago, the National Beef Quality Audit revealed problems leading to losses up the food chain due to injection sites. More losses occurred due to high damage created by iron branding. So over time, the beef industry has worked to inform and educate producers relative to reducing those losses by changing how we do things. The result has been a win-win. So in the future, will the World Wildlife Fund go as far as to recommend specific changes?
Recommending what?
Specific changes such as the ones that were just described.
Well, I think what you're talking about is a system that was set up, and then once that system was set up, producers actually could learn from each other about what the costs were of not doing it, as well as the cost of actually doing it. So the one place that I would say all of us have not done a good job is actually helping set up systems where producers can learn from each other much more quickly, and share information more quickly, and do site visits and go understand firsthand how somebody else has addressed an issue. We just haven't done that as well as we should. The Midwest Row Crop Collaborative is doing that around soil, and just starting with 100 different farmers sharing their data with other farmers around soy and corn row crops in Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. I haven't seen anything like that for beef yet, but I think it would be good. I think we've got to figure out how to use the 21st century tools to actually improve production, and IT is one of those tools that is really underutilized right now.
Okay, I have a question. I'm Stephen Graham. I have a question that was emailed in to me by Ryan Hamill. Dr. Clay, have you looked at how we can shift the world to a more plant-based diet and what impact that would have? Thank you.
So, remember when I was talking about 7.4 billion food experts? Well, that is one of the things that people care about more than anything else. They really don't like to be told what to do. We think that people would respond much better to knowing what the implications are of what they're doing. What are the consequences for their choices? How can they make more informed choices? And if you choose this, what else can you do to balance it? I think those are the kinds of things that we have to begin to talk about. The 800-pound gorilla here is consumption. How do we deal with the issue of consumption? We need to have that discussion in a way that hasn't yet happened with food. The biggest discussions we've had about food recently have been very polarized. One is GMO, one is animal welfare. We need to really figure out, can we talk about food waste? Can we talk about illegality? These are things that nobody's probably in favor of. Can we begin to use those to create a safe space where the science and the data and the opinions can shape the debate, but that the discussion can happen? And we're going to need to then convert that into a discussion about consumption. And it's clear that people are shifting diets all the time. McDonald's sells more chicken than they do beef, and they have for some time. They're actually selling about as many salads now as they do beef. I mean, it's a funny kind of thing, and yet this is going without people talking about it, but people are making choices, and that will continue. I would like us to think also, though, not just about the consumer side of this, but the production side. And we wrote a paper for Hank Paulson to carry to the Premier of China, basically arguing that China shouldn't buy feed grains, they should actually buy animal protein. And by producing the animal protein in the same areas that you produce feed grains, you can have closed-loop production. You can actually introduce all the manure and the waste products back into the soil to produce more grain. And that it would be better for China because they're not efficient animal protein producers. They produce a lot of pollution. They have more red tides than any other country. And a lot of that's directly related to runoff from animal protein production. Why not buy poultry? Why not buy beef? Why not buy other things from countries that can produce it more efficiently? This is comparative advantage. This is how you manage a planet.
Thanks so much, Dr. Clay. As the world's premier land-grant university, I'm sure we have a lot to offer as far as solutions go to this issue. But as an institution, I'm sure we're also committed to a variety of ways that promulgate the problem, commit ourselves to business as usual. So I think we'd all appreciate it if you could maybe give some specific critiques of how universities like ours aren't incentivized to really focus on sustainability. And like I said, keep focusing on business as usual, because I'm sure our students and our faculty would like to create the social change necessary at our institution in order to adequately contribute to the problems we talked about today. Thanks.
You know, it's interesting, and I went to a land-grant university for my PhD. I was at Cornell. It seems to me that universities, land-grant universities, have become so cumbersome that it's very hard for them to be innovative. And yet, now is the time that we need innovation more than ever. And how can we, with all the overheads associated with universities, how can we use little bits of money to test new things and kill them when they don't work? Or move them forward if they do? How can we do that more in an entrepreneurial way? I think we've got to figure out how to bring that spirit back into universities, because once you add on whatever your overhead rate is here, I don't know what it is, but once you start adding all these things on, everything just kind of grinds to a halt. And I would also say that the people who are often very good at fundraising in universities aren't necessarily the people that are going to be the most innovative in terms of the problems they're looking at or how they're looking at them. And we've got to figure out how to link these two together a little more. There are certainly plenty of problems that we need innovation on, and I think plenty of ways that universities can get engaged in them. But part of it is to let students and faculty and grad students and postdocs and everybody begin to experiment a bit more with this and see where we can come. Taking this totally out of the university context, we can't work on 100 problems right now. It's just humanly impossible to work on 100 things. If we can agree on 3 to 5 things, we can move the needle. Whether we're in a university, an NGO, in a company, whatever. So let's agree on the 3 to 5 things. K-State could agree on the 3 to 5 things it wants to really work on. You've got a lab on sustainable intensification. That's a good start. You've got a lab on post-harvest losses. That's a big area. Let's do it. Let's move those forward. But how can we do that in a really innovative way? What I see in terms of innovation in my world is I every year survey hundreds of people from different companies about what are the trends. One of the biggest trends now is that companies are investing less in R&D because there's too many things that they're interested in and they don't have enough money to cover them all, so it's easier just to go buy what they need. But even there, have we ever really thought about having a pre-competitive approach to venture capital? Could we have a prize to solve a problem and a bunch of venture capitalists agree to put money in to fund every horse in the race? Because even a horse that doesn't win can come up with a really good idea and a really good thing that's going to go to market and actually do something for somebody. So I think we just need to get much more focused in our work on this. I don't know if that exactly answers your question about K-State and what you can do, but I don't think it's just about K-State. I think it's about a whole system that we're involved in that needs to get unbroken. That needs to be broken a bit, to be unfrozen, and to move forward.
On the humorous side, should I sell my grassland and go up in Iowa and buy some ground for bananas?
Only if you can get the kind that actually produces protein.
No. Are you aware that one volcano in Ireland that recently erupted caused more CO2 than we have been able to save in this country in 5 years? And it's not done.
Indeed. Well, there's the things you can control and the things you can't control.
Well, I haven't got many more years to control it, but I think
Well, that's why I was wondering about the move to Iowa personally, but go for it.
I think that the Wildlife Federation, what I understand, would like to turn all of western United States into a park for bears, buffaloes, coyotes, and wolves, from what I have understood. Is that right?
No, I think you haven't quite understood. We're working with a lot of ranchers, and we actually see ranchers as being the best defense of grasslands and natural habitat in the West. So I don't know where you're getting your information, but I would put that one to rest. That is not a strategy.
Well, I knew you were promoting parks.
We do promote parks, absolutely, and we promote parks around the world.
Okay, if there's no one there, I'll speak. I've been in the livestock business 64 years nonstop, and I've witnessed things like this global sustainable beef with third-party policemen coming to your farm. Folks, we don't dare go there. The average size in Missouri is 28 cows. If anyone thinks a man with 28 cows is going to spend weeks at his desk filling out these 20-page questionnaires, how you did everything, and a policeman checking your water tanks, make sure you have the green scum off of it. The pond's got some algae. Folks, you don't know where this is going, and I'll tell you what, there's not a person on the planet that knows more about what you need to do on your farm than you, because you have lived there every day. If you're still there, you have survived. You have done a lot of the things that were most important, and you have in the back of your mind a lot of those things you know you need to do. But damn it, you can't afford to at today's prices. So in my opinion, this global sustainable beef needs to crash and burn. It's going to take a lot of small producers out. They're going to throw in the towel, I'll guarantee you.
What's your question?
My question is, another question. On the website, okay, the first. There's going to be 5 membership. One could be a producer, one could be allied industry, one will be processor, one retail, one civil society. So a producer, if he's lucky enough to get on this board of directors, will have 1 vote out of 5. He's outnumbered 4 to 1. Now you think a producer is going to have a chance of influencing policy? And these working groups, this sounds exactly like the UN, roundtable discussions, making the rules. So why, my question is, why does a producer have such a small input?
So the way most of these roundtables have been set up is that if any group is opposed to a specific language or a specific wording, that group can veto it for the whole group. And so that's why one producer group could actually have a big impact on these issues. But again, this is all voluntary. And I would just, from my own experience, not as long as you, but 65 years, how many of these small farmers have survived because of economics?
I didn't understand it.
The economic system that small farmers are competing in is very competitive and getting more so all the time. And small farmers are falling by the wayside. Small farmers, 70%, 80% of farmers in the U.S. have to have second incomes because they can't make a go of it. That's what we're actually talking about here. So this, I don't think, is actually pushing that any further than the market has already gone. Anyway, thank you for your observation and your comments.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, 1 and 1 more.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question about the role of the oceans, lakes, other bodies of water that could serve as a surface area for production of food. I was recently in Myanmar, working in Myanmar, using lakes. They were using lakes to produce vegetables above water bodies, and doing it very efficiently, intensively. I was wondering if you have any projections on approximately what kind of conversion you might see in the next 30 or 40 years.
So that's going to be dependent on a lot of things. And I would say probably freshwater systems, while they're a lot more accessible in the short term, aren't the long-term kind of solutions that oceans are. And so then we're talking about saltwater production. Ironically, if you wanted to produce more food in oceans and sequester more carbon, a carbon tax would be, a price on carbon would be one way to do that. And how I would go about looking at is bivalves. clams, oysters, mussels, scallops, even abalone. Grow them in the ocean. 4 tons of, so 1 ton of flesh of a clam or an oyster comes with 4 tons of shells. And the 4 ton of shells is actually 2 tons of carbon. So if you had any kind of a price on carbon, then you would actually be able to sell both the food and the carbon. And clams and oysters and mussels and these things don't require any feed at all. They live off the plankton and phytoplankton in the ocean. So it's a way to produce a lot of protein very inexpensively and sequester a lot of carbon and address issues of filtration of the ocean to make it cleaner, deal with ocean acidification, etc.
Last question.
Okay, this is from Gene Goslin. Can you please describe an illegally produced crop?
So if you want to take soy in Brazil, 65% of soy producers haven't complied with the forest code in Brazil. That means that about 25% of globally traded soybeans is not produced legally. If you want to take extra virgin olive oil in Italy, 80% is not extra virgin. And in fact, 50% of the olive oil in the US is not even thought to be olive oil. It's canola with green dye. So there's a lot of different examples. If you're interested in this, I can send you a paper about this that is the results that we came up with. I can also send you a paper about long-term contracts and how they're currently being used. And we use these distribution of draft papers as a way to get other insights and other information to put into the analysis so that it becomes a living document.
Please help me thank Dr. Clay one more time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Folks, thank you all for coming. This concludes our lecture. Thank you very much.